Hello, everyone. Seems like the flow of the waiting room has slowed down a little bit, so we'll go ahead and get started here. Thank you so much for joining us today. We understand the recent winter storms have impacted people across the nation, so we're so grateful that you are able to join us today. Welcome to our third and final session in a three-part series on the warrior ethos of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP, of World War II. I'm Captain Carrie Wise, an instructor pilot in the 94th Flying Training Squadron, based at Davis Airfield at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I will be your host today as we continue our discussion with expert historian Dr. Catherine Sharp Landeck. Dr. Landeck is an associate professor of history at Texas Women's University, the home of the WASP archives. She is a Guggenheim Fellow at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, a Normandy Scholar, and a graduate of the University of Tennessee, where she earned her PhD. Dr. Landeck has received numerous awards for her more than 2 decades of work on the WASP, and has appeared as an expert on NPR's Morning Edition, PBS, and the History Channel. Her work has been published in the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Time. In addition, Dr. Landeck published her first book in 2020 titled The Women with Silver Wings, the inspiring true story of the women Air Force service pilots of World War II. My teammate, Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Thomas, also an instructor pilot at the 94th, will be our producer today. She will be monitoring the chat and ensuring all of our tech runs smoothly. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas led our session last week, which was an incredible and insightful discussion and a huge hit. If you missed that session, don't worry about it. We have it recorded and we'll keep you all posted on where that can be found publicly, likely on the NCLS webpage. Today's event is sponsored by the United States Air Force Academy Center for Character and Leadership Development, or the CCLD, in association with the National Character and Leadership Symposium 2021. This year's NCLS will be held on the 25th and 26th of February and will cover the theme of warrior ethos. Just a few housekeeping items to go over. As you saw in the very beginning, please keep your mics muted and cameras off for the duration of the session. Sessions will be recorded and is currently being recorded, and it will capture any user with sound on, so mics off. The chat will be used to deliver links and any additional information, but we have turned off the option for attendees to chat one another or to post publicly. But you can use that chat to message the hosts, and Lieutenant Colonel Thomas will be using that to monitor questions that you all ask and pose them at the end for Dr. Landeck. Finally, I just want to remind everyone to be respectful of each other and truly hope you all enjoy today's session. Dr. Landeck, welcome to our third session.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
In our first session, we discussed some of the broad information about the WASP, as well as their two main leaders, Nancy Love and Jackie Cochran. We really dove into the importance of those two women and the allyship and advocacy in building warrior ethos. Last week in session 2, we explored some more of the specific missions that the WASP undertook, as well as that social and political context in which those missions took place, and the warrior ethos required of those women to help them succeed in the face of such social adversity. For the purposes of this year's NCLS, USAFA describes warrior ethos as the embodiment of the warrior spirit, tough-mindedness, tireless motivation, and unceasing vigilance, a willingness to sacrifice one's life for the country if necessary, and a commitment to be the world's premier air, space, and cyberspace force. Today, we will keep this definition in mind as we dive into the warrior ethos skills these women had to apply in the years following World War II, after the WASP had been disbanded. Before we get into that though, Dr. Landeck, would you mind starting us out with just a short refresher on the WASP program and the overall mission?
Sure, of course. So just some basic understanding of who the WASP were. Of course, from September of 1942 to December of 1944, you have 1,102 women who wore those silver wings. You had women who joined in the fall of 42 with a lot of flight experience and went very quickly into serving as ferry pilots. Then you have about 25,000 women apply to go through the training program. 1,830 were chosen, some trained in Houston, most of them trained in Sweetwater, Texas. And they went through the same flight training as the male pilots that were going through the Army Air Forces at the time. And then again, 1,102 of them ended up wearing their wings, doing all sorts of different jobs that the Army Air Forces needed to happen. Everything from ferrying those planes from the factories where the Rosie the Riveters were building them, to towing targets, to train the men on the ground, to flying planes and proving that they were so easy to fly, even a girl could do it, to convince the men that they were, safe planes to fly. So they just basically did whatever job needed to be done to help their country during the war effort.
From 42 to 44 really isn't a long time, but there is so much that happened. Thank you for the brief overview. And it really is so difficult to capture all that the WASP were and did just in these 3 short sessions. But thankfully, our participants can continue finding out more about these amazing women, even after our session has ended today. Dr. Landeck, you've been featured in several podcasts and even released your first book last year, The Women with Silver Wings. Our producer, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas, will actually post links to all of those things in the chat so our listeners can tune in on those later on.
Thank you.
So Dr. Landeck, let's dive in. To get us rolling, just how did the WASP come to end? And more specifically, what was the timeline and the decision-making process that really went into that the disbandment?
Yeah, I think this is a question that's often asked about the WASP of World War II, because they are ended in December of 1944, which, if you know your World War II history, that's right in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. We were still fighting in Germany. We were still fighting against Japan. The war was far from over, and yet the women were sent home. So how did we get there? And that's always a frustrating thing for the WASP when they spoke about it, and I think even for me to understand why. One of the things to understand about the WASP is that they came into the Army Air Forces as civilians. They were brought in as civilian pilots. The plan of the Army Air Forces was to do what they did with male service pilots, was to bring them in as civilians, let them serve for 90 days, kind of a 90-day probation, and then they would be brought in as second lieutenants. And that was the idea, was you just bring them in, integrate them right into the field. There were ideas about, okay, no, let's keep the women segregated. Let's keep them separate. It made things complicated. Then you have all this legislation that's brought up to officially bring the women into the Army Air Forces, starting in 1943, continuing into 1944, until you have in early 1944, bills coming before Congress to bring the women into the military. You have a group of male pilots who had been flight instructors, civilian flight instructors for the Army Air Forces, that had lost their draft deferred positions. We didn't need as many pilots, so they weren't producing as many pilots. Now these men turn and look and see all these, what they termed girls, flying these planes, and said, well, you don't need these girls, you've got us. So that turned into a political game where they went to their politicians and said, why are you letting these women fly when we are? And all of it comes to a head in June of 1944. Of course, again, if you know your World War II history, they're right around the same time as the invasion of Normandy in France. So just as we are storming the beaches and gaining ground and not being pushed back into the sea, the bill to admit the WASP into the military proper comes before Congress. And it's just too much. Where you've got these men who are fighting against the women. You've got Congress and the American people saying, hey, look, we're doing well in the war. Maybe we don't need all these pilots, and maybe we don't need these women pilots. So in June of 1944, late June of 1944, Congress decides to end the training program, right? They're going to let the women who are already in training finish. then they're going to let them keep flying once they continue on. So the last class, 44W10, which is the 18th class of trainees, is allowed to finish, but they graduate December 7th, 1944. And what happens is in October of 1944, General Arnold, who's the head of the Army Air Forces, decides, by October, we've liberated Paris, we've liberated Rome, we're about to cross the Rhine, we're really making good progress. And the Battle of the Bulge hasn't occurred yet, right? We think we're going to win by Christmas. And in October, he says, the goal of hiring these women as pilots was to release men for other flying duty. By October of 1944, General Arnold said, now the women are just replacing the men, and we don't want that, and we don't need them. So he announced in October that they would be disbanded in December. And despite the fact that, things had turned ugly in December of 1944, he stuck with it. And December 20th, 1944 is the last date any of the women flew for the Army Air Forces in an official capacity.
I like using the term political game, and it really sounds like it was. These women undoubtedly were a part of helping assure an Allied victory, even at that point in December of 1944. So once they were disbanded, where did these women go? What did they do? Did any of them actually get to continue serving in the military?
Yeah, this is a great question. And this is something that was a big part of my research, and something, I always wanted to know what happened next, right? My favorite part of movies is always when they stream at the end, the little, so-and-so went and did this afterwards, and so-and-so went and did this. I always want to know what happens next. And so that's been a real focus of my research is, well, what they do after that, so they went home, and then what? A lot of these women were heartbroken. This was their chance to serve, their chance to fly. Some of these women felt really guilty, especially those women in the later classes who'd had all this great training from the military and expensive training, and then they weren't able to serve. They weren't able to give back in the way that they had been trained to do. A lot of the women were embarrassed. They go home to their families in time for Christmas and the winter holidays, and their families say, well, why are you here? We're in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, and well, you must not have been that important what you were doing. So it was really, not a good time for most of these women. Now, some of them did go and join the Army, right? The Women's Army Corps, and do different things like that. A few of these women had been trained as nurses before the war, and so went and joined as nurses. A lot of the women were able to find jobs working in the air traffic control towers, especially on military bases. A lot of the bases where the women served knew they had value. They were no longer allowed in the cockpit or on the flight line because they were women all of a sudden, but they were valuable in that they knew the jargon, and they knew the planes, and they knew what was happening. So a lot of them were able to get jobs very quickly in the months after they'd been disbanded. One of the tools that the women did was they created an organization called the Order of Fifinella. So this is Fifinella here behind me. Right, she was their mascot. And in the summer of 1944, once they realized things weren't going well, they created this organization, the Order of Fifinella, and they created a newsletter so they could communicate with one another. And it was all about jobs. It was sharing jobs with one another and helping each other. Okay, this base wants us, or there were companies that, as the war winds down, these women are able to fly, we have all these planes, thousands and thousands of planes that the government doesn't need anymore. So they were flying these planes to, to the graveyards, to the boneyards and things like that. So they were able to find these jobs in the immediate months after the war. And then, of course, once the Air Force is created, right, the proper Air Force is created, they send the WASP letters and say, hey, don't you want to come back and serve in the reserves? Come and serve in the U.S. Air Force reserves. You won't be able to be a pilot because we don't need girl pilots anymore. But and you shouldn't wear your wings, although many of the women did. But come and serve with us. We want you back. Over 200 of the women, 240 of the women joined the Air Force Reserves and were able to serve. There were other women who joined, were very excited to join. And not long after they joined, most of them, it occurred closer to the time of Korea when they were called to active duty. But the Air Force realized they had children under the age of 14. And women were not allowed to serve in the military at the time if they had children under the age of 14. So I've seen the letters where they're invited to be a part of the Air Force, and then they're uninvited. Oh, wait a minute, you had children under the age of 14. So they were uninvited to their service. The one WASP, they were all supposed to resign, and one WASP said, no, I'm not. and they didn't really do anything about it. She just stayed in. And so they all had different experiences, but they definitely tried to do what they could in the years after the war.
Yeah, you definitely describe a lot of different experiences. There were just so many emotions going on and so much tension with these spaces that they fought hard to be a part of, and then were automatically no longer invited into. Mm-hmm. So considering all that we knew about the WASP, they flew multiple types of aircraft, they tested airplanes and new mission sets, they instructed. Mm-hmm. You mentioned heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking to hear that their skills weren't desired beyond the WASP. But despite that, these women continued to forge on with their lives. Do you think there were any experiences in the WASP that contributed to them having that mental toughness to deal with such rejection and still move forward to build successful lives?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And this is where I really think, we've talked about that warrior ethos. And this is the period that I really think it shines, this post-war period of the immediate post-war years, and then the 1950s and 60s. And then I know we're going to talk later about their fight to be veterans, but this idea of the confidence that they gained from doing hard things and doing well, that stuck with them their whole lives. The fact that they could take an airplane off the ground and land it again, just themselves in the plane, that's a powerful thing. The fact that they could make it through training and they could make it through these missions, usually by themselves or in these very tough environments, and they could serve their country in that way, that really stuck with them. The fact that they were a part of something bigger than themselves and that they did make a difference really helped make those little indignities of life not quite as big of a deal, because a lot of these women got married and had families, and some worked and had jobs or created their own businesses, whether fixed base operations for aviation or secretarial businesses or whatever. But they knew they could do it, and they knew they could get through hard times because they had gotten through hard times, and they had a great confidence in themselves.
That confidence in their resilient attitude and their resilient habits that they had built really seems to have paid dividends down the road. And it's actually something that we kind of attribute to that generation, right? We talk a lot about how they were willing to be and welcomed being part of something far bigger than themselves.
Mhm.
When we look back at World War II, we often talk about the greatest generation. We give recognition and refer to them with awe and reverence for all that they did and sacrificed for the world during those years. The WASP absolutely were a part of that. But it wasn't until many years later that the nation began to even think about the WASP as veterans. Could you talk about that journey?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that I think is really important. That those decisions that were made in 1944 to not bring them into the Army Air Forces really had a great impact on these women's lives. And, you know, they were brought in, most of them expecting to be made a part of the military because that's what they were told was, you know, don't sign up unless you're willing to serve officially. So when they were disbanded, you know, Jackie Cochran, who was one of their leaders, said, look, make them military just for a day. So they can have that insurance and they can have those benefits that come with the service that they did. Of course, they weren't. And there was a small effort in 1945, 1946, 47, a small effort by some of the WASP to say, hey, you know, we really are veterans. Can you recognize us? And I was pretty quickly rejected because everybody was worried about money, you know, and you know, 1,100 women they thought would break the bank, I guess. But starting in the 1960s, you have these women that did serve in the Air Force Reserves, especially, and you have some who served in the Air Force proper. You had one, Pat Pateman, whose records are right there at the Air Force Academy. She donated all her papers there. She served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. So you have these really amazing women. Well, a lot of them are starting to retire from the reserves in the 1960s, and they realized that their time in the service during World War II didn't count towards their retirement and wouldn't be recognized in that way. And they're like, well, you know, let's fix that. So there's some that start in the 1960s already pushing to be recognized as veterans, and they had already missed the GI Bill of Rights. They had already missed the medical care that a number of them needed from either accidents or hearing damage from those planes that they flew. All those things that would have been good for them, they'd lost out on. And many of them lamented that. You know, I'd talked to them in the years after, you know, in the last 20 years or so, and you know, more than one has said, God, if I just had that GI Bill, I could have gone back to college, you know, and could have gotten that loan, could have gotten that better job, could have, you know, had those opportunities. But really, you have this effort in Congress in the late 60s to, you know, make these women veterans, and it kind of keeps falling flat. And then in the early 1970s, the military starts announcing that for the first time ever, we're going to let women fly our planes. The Army does it, the Navy does it, then the Air Force does it. It says for the first time ever, we're going to have women flying our planes. And I got to tell you, this really makes these women mad.
Absolutely,
you know, the women, the women who, you know, there was a small group who'd really been pushing for it to be recognized. It said, you know, we need to be recognized. And then this comes out in the news, and the rest of them are like, wait a minute, you forgot us. And a lot of them thought about those 38 women who died serving during the WASP and said, you forgot them and those 38 who died. So you have this huge grassroots effort, and that's all that can be said of it, of these women to be recognized as veterans. They have calling trees, which I don't know the age of the people on this call. Some of you know what a calling tree is, right? But where you'd have captains, calling tree captains, and they would call, you know, they'd call 4 people who would then call their own 4 people who would then write a calling tree. That's what we did before we could do a group text, I guess. I don't know if and they, you know, red alert, and they'd call their congressmen and senators when bills were coming up. The Stars and Stripes hired one of the WASP to be a writer for them. So all the WASP got the Stars and Stripes. So every week they could get the update on what was going on with the legislation and what they needed to do and which congressman they needed to write and when they needed to quit, take a break from their job and go to Washington, D.C. And it's just this years long process that these women went through to try to be recognized as veterans.
It sounds like they had such a strong sense of community to really encourage that transformative change in policy. The discussion about recognition and veteran status really brings up a great point. You mentioned the VA loan and the GI Bill. At the end of World War II, there were a lot of benefits for those who had fought just like those, and many others like the veteran support organizations like the American Legion, et cetera. These really help service members accrue wealth and status and work through that mental aspect of transitioning to life beyond their wartime mission. Were these women ever able to enjoy these benefits once they achieved that veteran status?
No. So they got, they were finally recognized in 1977 as veterans. Their bill was added on as an amendment. Their recognition of them was added on as an amendment to an education bill. And thanks to Senator Barry Goldwater, who I always think it's the most ironic, because Barry Goldwater was one of the only senators to vote against the Equal Rights Amendment, which of course passed in 1972, but it missed being ratified by 3 states. But in the 1970s, everybody thought it was a done deal, right? This Equal Rights Amendment, and he had voted against it. And yet he steps up to help these WASP gain this recognition. And he promises them, okay, I'm going to just keep adding it as an amendment. This is after they testified before the Senate, testified before the House, this whole process. He says, you know what, I'm just going to keep adding it as an amendment. But Barry Goldwater had flown with the women in the Ferry Command. And so he was, like we talked about, those allies that recognize the abilities of these women. So they finally are recognized, they're given this recognition. But the way the bill is written, it recognizes them for the purposes as veterans, for the purposes of the Veterans Administration. So by the 1970s, the GI Bill and all those things were lost. Many of the women, one in particular, Elaine Harmon, they tried to get a job using the VA or the recognition as veterans to get that preference. And they weren't given it because the way the bill was written very narrowly interpreted that they were only eligible for Veterans Administration benefits, nothing else. So it was a strange reading of the bill. Barry Goldwater got very angry because, of how it was being interpreted. But that was the deal. Many of the women were very happy to have that VA benefit. Of course, they were in their 50s and 60s when it was finally passed, and many of the women up until their final days were using the Veterans Administration hospitals and benefits. So they were grateful to have it. A lot of the women, the biggest thing they wanted was that flag on their coffin. They wanted that flag. They wanted that recognition that they had served their country in World War II. And that was a really big deal for them.
The shift you talk about with Senator Goldwater from being against the equal rights movement and then becoming an ally, that takes quite the shift and quite the show of confidence for this incredible group of women. So you just mentioned having a flag on their coffin. There were a lot of lobbying and advocacy efforts on the part of WASP, on the part of different politicians like Senator Goldwater. Can you talk a little bit about the burial rights and maybe a little bit about Arlington?
Yeah, so that was a big deal for the women to be able to be buried in a military cemetery for their own service. A number of them married veterans. There were so many veterans after World War II in that generation, but to be buried under their own name with their own service recognized was a really important thing for them. And yeah, obviously Arlington National Cemetery is the biggest, and a number of wasps were placed there. They were inurned there, and it was kind of a big deal. Um, and then a few years ago, we had Elaine Harmon, who I mentioned earlier. Elaine was a friend of mine. She was actually the first WASP I ever interviewed. I did my oral history with her and her friend Ruth Carney in 1996, which shows how long ago it was, I guess. But Elaine was from Silver Springs, Maryland, and she wanted to be buried at Arlington, wanted to be placed there. And when she died, her family called them up to make the arrangements, and they said, "Sorry, WASP are no longer eligible to be at Arlington." And nobody could believe it. What happened? Well, because that bill had been written so narrowly in 1977 and said the WASP are veterans for the purposes of the Veterans Administration, Arlington National Cemetery is run by the Secretary of the Army. So worrying about space at Arlington, obviously this is a finite space, they said, okay, we're going to leave certain groups out. Well, when the WASP bill was passed, it wasn't just the WASP. There were a whole chain of people that were kind of tagged along with them. The telephone operators, the female telephone operators from World War I, who'd been given no veterans recognition, no benefits, they were tagged on with the WASP in that bill. The merchant Marines, who had done so much in World War II, and so many died and so much risk was taken, they hadn't been recognized as part of the military. They tagged along with the Wasp of World War II. So you have all these types of pseudo military groups that lobbied enough to be tagged on with the WASP. So it wasn't just the WASP that were cut out of Arlington. It was all those groups too. And the Merchant Marines, there were thousands and thousands of Merchant Marines. So I think that's really what they were worried about. Of course, Elaine's family was as smart and stubborn as Elaine was, and had both a public relations expert and a lawyer among her grandchildren. And they worked very hard and coordinated with some members of Congress and the Senate, and fought and had a bill passed that allowed the WASP back into Arlington National Cemetery, and we were able to have a full service. I was there. It was very moving to have a full service with Elaine placed in her little wall, and it made a lot of people very happy to see that final recognition.
Understandably happy too. That is such a significant win, really, for these women to have that honor of being buried with military honors, with the flag, and at Arlington. The WASP impacted not just policies, but they impacted people too. You mentioned the telephone operators. They impacted women service members beyond just female pilots. So when we think about the military bringing women back into the cockpit, not for the first time, in the 70s, what role did the WASP play? Do you think the policymakers looked to the WASP experiment, as it was often referred to make that decision or impact any of the policies around it?
It's interesting. So they there were some that remembered the WASP, and but that's certainly how they were created, right? That they were created as this experiment, and lots of good records were kept, medical records were kept, all of these things. But it was really, I think, that Equal Rights Amendment, and you've got the Equal Rights Amendment passes. You've got the end to the all volunteer force, right? The creation of the all volunteer force at the end of Vietnam. And just this idea of, okay, well, we're going to need all the people we need. You have some who were involved with the WASP, like Jacqueline Cochran, who'd been this great leader of the group, who actually went to Congress and testified against women being admitted into the Air Force Academy. Sorry, Academy women. But and said, that's not what women should do. It was war and it was different. But then you have the WASP who end up serving as real mentors to those women who were coming through in the 1970s. They create this organization, the Women Military Aviators, which includes a lot of these younger women. And so the WASP helped bring these younger women along, and the younger women helped the WASP gain the recognition they deserved. So it was a real partnership. Whether the WASP flying proved that women could do it, and talked people into letting women fly in the 1970s. I think once the women started finding their voice again, which occurred in the 1970s and 80s, I think that really did give that kind of lie to the idea that women could only fly lighter aircraft, or that picture you open this session with of the 4 WASP in front of the B-17. It's like, come on, they flew the B-17. There were first pilots in the B-17 and the B-29 and all these different planes. Women can fly whatever they want, and they'll put if they're too short, they'll put a parachute behind them and underneath them and do the job anyway. So I think they inspired a lot of people, and they proved that women could fly anything, right? The airplane doesn't care what the gender is.
That's such a great point. Mm-hmm. And the WASP they truly are inspiring. Their efforts were lifelong. They, from when they first became pilots, many of them before World War II, even before the WASP was created, and then into those endeavors all the way up to death, essentially. There's so much to their story. And while the WASP were an organization only officially existed for really a short time. I mean, 2 years, really. Their story spans almost an entire century and has so many facets from which we can all learn lessons. With that, let's go ahead and take some questions from the audience. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas, have we gotten any?
This is the first, actually. We don't have any yet. So luckily, we have some pre-prepared. So Dr. Landa, can you tell us if there are any WASP who are still alive, and where can we go to hear their personal stories?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have, I'm afraid we're under 30 now, which is hard, but we just lost B. Haydu last week, who had led the WASP fight for that veterans recognition in the 1970s. She was president of their post-war organization in the 1970s. It's actually B. Haydu who you see. There's a pretty famous photo of the WASP were given recognition at the Congressional Gold Medal in 2010. It was signed by President Obama in 2009. There's a pretty famous picture. You can find it if you just Google it. And it's President Obama sitting in a chair, and it's modern Air Force women, but it's also B. Haydu, Lorraine Rogers, who was a WASP who lived in the area, and Elaine Harmon, all standing around him as he signed that Congressional Gold Medal. And he gave B. Haydu the pen, which was a big deal for B, because no WASP were allowed at the signing of the bill in 1977. So it always bothered her that she didn't get a pen. and President Obama handed B the pen, and she was really happy to have that. But she had turned 100 this winter, and we just lost her a couple of weeks ago. We have, all these women are 97, 98, all the way up to 103. There's one WASP in particular who still does a lot of media work. Nell Bright, or Mickey Bright. She was in class 43W7. She's a good friend of mine. She flew out at Biggs Field in El Paso and flew B-26s, and among other things. But she's up in Salt Lake City, and she and I did a talk with Powell's together, Powell's bookstore. She's into Zooming. She likes Zooming, so she does Zooming talks. And we're actually going to be on Good Morning America 3, which I guess is in the afternoon, on March 8th, International Women's Day. So you'll be able to see her there. So she turns 100 in June. but is, zooming all over the place and giving talks and doing really well. So I'm trying to create more opportunities for her to speak, just because I know everybody'd rather listen to a WASP talk than to me talk, which is as it should be. So that's been one of the hard things for me, is to go from sharing a stage with them and kind of being a moderator of 10 of them on the stage to standing alone on the stage. But, I promised them a long time ago that I would tell their story when they were gone. So I feel very fortunate that they trusted me with it. And I think it's really the job of all of us to share their story. And I really appreciate the two of you creating this opportunity, and others to share their story, because I think they really do fit that warrior ethos, and they're so stubborn. They're so stubborn their whole lives. They're going to fight to learn how to fly, and in the 1930s and early 40s, and they're going to fight to serve their country, and they're going to, fight to be remembered and fight to be buried. They're just they really prove that you can make things happen. You don't win all of the fights by any means, but if you stick with things, you can make change and live a full life, for sure.
Okay, let's go to the next question. So this is from Hugh Burns. He wants to know, did you ever meet Nancy Love's daughters while conducting your research?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I never met Nancy Love's daughters. I have emailed with Nancy's daughter, one of her daughters, and talked on the phone with her quite a bit. And then I've actually talked with her nephew quite a bit. He sent me a very fun video of Nancy Love buzzing his mother's wedding, and buzzing it down low and things like that. So, everybody was getting on a boat or something, and she went out in her airplane and buzzed them. So I never got to meet them. I'm hoping Allie has invited me to come out to her house sometime, but of course we're in a pandemic. So that makes things harder, but I hope to get out there. And she said she has boxes of papers that I'd love to go look at, but never got to meet them in person, but I have talked to them, which was really, really fortunate to have the chance to do that.
We have another question. This is from Captain Lillian Pryor. She wants to know what led to your interest in specializing in the history of the WASP.
I think that's a great question, because obviously it's been, a lifetime of my adult life practically. I'll tell you, I went to an air show. I was working in Tulsa at Spartan School of Aeronautics. I had a bachelor's in history and political science, and they had an associate degree program. So I taught history and government for them, which, and sandbagged as much as I could in the back of those 172s with all the guys. But Bartlesville was having a big Bartlesville Biplane Expo, and I couldn't get anybody to go with me. Nobody. I worked at a flight school, had all these guys who were friends who were pilots and all of this, and none of them wanted to go. So I was like, well, I'll go myself. And I'm so glad I did, because I never would have had this happen. After the air show, there was a Pitts special parked that had performed in the show, and the pilot came up while I was looking in the cockpit and said, hey, under that shade of the hangar is Curtis Pitts. He said, you should go say hi. I'm like, well, I'm being bold today, I'll go say hi. So I walked over to him and was a complete dork and said, Mr. Pitts, you sure make a cool airplane. And he was a nice guy. And he said, well, this is Carol Bailey Bosca sitting next to me here, and she won the National Aerobatic Championship in 1951 in my second airplane. What are you talking about? I didn't know women did that. So I spent 20 minutes talking to them, and then went to have a picture taken with them, because I had my camera, not my phone, but it was a camera. So it was a big deal to get your picture with somebody, and a film camera, which shows how old I am, I guess. But after we took the picture, some crazy lady ran up and said, "You're Carol Bailey Bosca. You flew B-25s in World War II." And I was like, "What?" And I'd never heard of them. And nobody at the flight school where I worked had ever heard of them. And that was really wrong. And so that I guess I'm a little stubborn too. That was it. I decided, how different would my life have been if I'd grown up knowing about them or anybody. So I just started from there. Carol had given me her name and address, and I went to graduate school so I could learn how to do history the right way and learn how to do oral histories with them the right way. And that was it. I'd always loved airplanes. I grew up in Omaha, not far from Sac Air Force Base, and all the airplanes going overhead all the time. I was always looking up, getting in trouble from my soccer coach for always looking at the airplanes instead of looking for the ball. But it was just the right fit. I got to talk about airplanes, and I think honestly, the Wasp were at the right stage of life that they wanted to tell their story to somebody. It's the 1990s. They were in their early 70s. And here's somebody who loves airplanes and kind of could speak their language a little bit, that wanted to know their stories. So it was perfect timing and perfect luck. And it's kind of a long response to your question, but I was really lucky, and it taught me, and I tell people all the time, if you want to do something, go do it. Don't wait for somebody to go with you. Because if I'd not gone that day, my life would be totally different. And if I'd gone with somebody, would I have stuck around after the air show and talked to Curtis Pitts and, I don't know. So follow your own path and make your own. Kind of a long response, but
We've got one more. So this is from Robert Toy, and he wants to know how many of the Mercury 13, the women that Dr. Randy Lovelace recruited and medically screened as potential early astronaut candidates, were WASP.
There was one who was a WASP who did that, and then Jacqueline Cochran actually funded it. She knew Lovelace well from her earlier flying, and she funded it. And was a big part of that. There's a really good book by Margaret Weidekamp about the Mercury 13 called Right Stuff, Wrong Sex. There are other books out there, but I think Margaret Weidekamp's is the best. And she talks about that and talks about but there was one WASP in particular that was a part of that. And of course, Jackie is a huge part of it, and a part of its demise, because she doesn't fund it anymore once she realizes NASA doesn't want them. She doesn't want to push that too far. But that's a whole nother very interesting story for sure. But look at Margaret's book, The Right Stuff, Wrong Sex. It really is an excellent book and has a lot of good resources. She's a historian. She's actually a curator at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. She's on the space side, and she's her responsibility is popular culture space stuff. So she's in charge of the spaceship Enterprise and all of that fun stuff. So, but take a look at that book. That's a great resource.
Okay, I love this next question. Love it, love it. Hugh Burns wants to know, have you been approached about film rights?
Hugh. So Dr. Burns is an old friend of mine. He helped me get my job at TW when he was an English professor. I often credit him with my academic career because he interrupted my interview and said, "You have to hire her." So Dr. Burns is a very loyal and good friend that is now out there. So the rights to the book were purchased, and I was in talks with 20th Century Fox, and then the pandemic hit and Hollywood shut down. So we are in new negotiations and all of those fun things, and hopefully we can make something happen. But of course, the world has not been my friend, but patience, I'm very patient. So I'd like something to happen before we lose all of our wasps, but I'm working on it, Hugh. I'm working on it, I promise.
Okay, we've got some others.
Okay.
So what can people do to help continue the WASP legacy and ensure their story continues to be shared?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a great question. I appreciate it. So, I think one thing is to tell people the story and share it as often as possible. And, my goal from the beginning has been to never walk into another room where people didn't know who the Wasp were. That just seems crazy to me, that they aren't celebrated and known everywhere. My publisher would like you to say buy my book, but that's not why we're here, but they would like me to say that. And the one thing that does distinguish it is it talks about that middle period of the 1950s and 60s, which I think is an interesting time. But I really think there are organizations like Women in Aviation International that one of the things they're doing every year, which I think is a really great thing, is on Memorial Day every year, they're remembering the Wasp. And they have a way that you can go and find Wasp graves near you and go and put flags on their graves, which is something that, of course, is very special. I've talked to a number of family members who've gone to their mother's graves and found flags that strangers have placed there, and that just has meant the world to them. So that, I think that's a really great place, is that Women in Aviation International. I think, Texas Women's University is home of the WASP archives. And I think, have the kids in your lives write reports on them. And, I know Seattle Museum of Flight is doing a new badge on them, and for the Girl Scouts and different things like that. So I think there's just, tell their story as broadly as you can. And I think remembering them on Memorial Day has really, it's moved me, because they put it out on social media, and, to see the graves of women I knew honored in that way has really been, has been very moving for me, and I know for their families for sure. But spread the word, right? My goal is to infect all of you with the same passion for these women that I've had, so that you'll go, like our calling tree, right? Now you're part of the calling tree here, to go and tell everybody you know about them. And I think they would want me to say, and B's big thing that she would end every talk with was, find out what your dream is and what your path is, and then go for it. Whatever, it doesn't have to be flying. Find out what your passion is, and then do it. And that's really what they strove to do, to inspire people to follow their own dreams.
Okay, we have one last question. So you may or may not know, this is from Jacob Becker. You may or may not know that at the U.S. Air Force Academy, each class nominates a class exemplar, someone whose traits and characteristics they resonate with as a class. If you were to nominate one WASP to be a class exemplar, who would it be?
That's a really good question. That's really neat that you guys do that. I have a whole list of WASP I could choose from. So if there are particular traits, I think I could definitely help. I think there are a couple that really stand out. I think Teresa James, who I focus on in my book, was pretty outstanding. She was a stunt pilot in the 30s, and then was a WAFs and a ferry pilot. And then she went on to serve in the reserves after the war, and she helped lead the fight to be veterans starting in the 1960s. So I think Teresa James would definitely be one. I think another one that was pretty outstanding is, it's a lot of names, but Dora, Dougherty, Strother, Mccown. She married twice, her first time in her 40s. So ladies never give up, or men never give up, or whoever, I don't know. And the second time in her 80s. So she was an optimist for sure. But Dora, learned to fly in the civilian pilot training program when she was in college. Then she went on and she was that first group that flew planes at Camp Davis, towed targets at Camp Davis. And then she's actually one of the two women that flew the B-29 with Colonel Paul Tibbets, General Paul Tibbets, right? To prove that it was so easy to fly, even a woman could do it, right? I told that story last time, I think. And then after the war, she went on and got her PhD in human engineering and worked for Bell Helicopter for decades, leading that human flight engineering program, broke all sorts of records as a helicopter pilot and things like that. So just really served on Dockowitz and all sorts of really inspirational, really groundbreaking work. So I think Dora would be a really amazing person to be recognized in that way as well. So feel free to contact me. I've got a whole list. I can share them with every class. But I thank you for asking that question, because I think these women are real inspirations, and the life they led, not just leading up to and during the war, but the lives they led after the war, are really pretty outstanding, and show that, we all go through stages of life and new opportunities. And just because one door closes doesn't mean you can't kick down the next one, kick that next one open. So thank you for asking that question. I appreciate that.
The Wasp really do give us so much insight and so much advice from their own struggles and their successful struggles.
Mm-hmm. And their also, failures. I would argue their failures too, where they weren't able to succeed, but then they picked themselves up and moved on from those failures. I think that perseverance is just as important as when they had those successes, that you can fail and you can survive it and move on. And I think that's really important to remember.
And that perseverance so perfectly describes warrior ethos.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I'm super excited for that movie. I would definitely.
Fingers crossed, right? Me
Fingers
too.
Crossed, yes. All right. Well, we are coming up on time. That was an absolutely wonderful discussion. Those are excellent questions, too. We truly appreciate all of you, all of our listeners tuning in, and we encourage everyone to continue learning more about the Wasp and share their story. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, it really is time for us to wrap up this 3-part series. It's been nearly 80 years since the Wasp organization was initially established. A lot has changed in our country, in our Air Force since then. And unfortunately, as we have discussed throughout this series, some of the same challenges the Wasp faced are still being faced by female pilots and female service members in general. For instance, according to the Air Force Personnel Center, the U.S. Air Force currently employs just over 12,000 pilots. But of those, only 838 are women. Pilot math here, but that's somewhere between 6 and 7%. Just as we have discussed with the Wasp, the reasons are myriad for this disparity, and they range from barriers to entry like socioeconomic status or ignorance about available waivers and programs. It might be barriers with culture or outdated regulations. But that being said, there is good news. Every single day, more women join the Air Force. More women apply to the Air Force Academy. More women get promoted and take command of units. In addition, the Air Force is taking another page from the WASP and has set up organizations like the Women's Initiative Team. They work to collect data and lobby on behalf of women and other underrepresented groups. They've effected changes to policy like hair regulations, limitations of pregnancies while on flying status, and they're even working to modernize how we build our actual aircraft platforms. The 1,102 women of the WASP blazed a seemingly unpassable trail. They embodied warrior ethos, and so did their advocates and allies. They never gave up on the mission. We hope you all have learned something about these incredible women and will join us in keeping their story alive. To learn more about the WASP or get involved with the Women's Initiative team, check out the resources listed in the chat. And we have social media, so follow Dr. Landick as well as the WIT on their various accounts. Twitter is a great one there. This concludes our final session of the Warrior Ethos of the Women Air Force Service Pilots. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you especially to Dr. Landick from Texas Women's University for sharing the WASP story and educating us on their warrior ethos. We hope you all stay safe and warm with the impacts from the recent winter storms, and we genuinely hope to see you all at NCLS next week on February 25th and 26th. While registration is no longer available, please keep an eye out. There are possibilities to watch the recordings from NCLS. Thank you again, and I will end this series with the WASP motto. We live in the wind and sand, and our eyes are on the stars.
Very nice. Thank you very much.